My name is Grace, and the first thing you should know about my family is that the sound of breaking things was far more common than the sound of laughter. He wasn't angry about the plate. He was angry that a tool had finally spoken back. In our house, perched on the edge of Millfield, Ohio, my silence was the currency we used to buy a brittle kind of peace. Millfield is a town haunted by the ghosts of industry, where rusted factories stand like skeletons against a perpetually gray sky. My father, Walter, was one of the men left behind when the steel mill closed, and his bitterness seeped into the very floorboards of our home. My brother, Shane, was the golden boy, the last flickering ember of my parents' dreams, shielded from the town's decay and his own incompetence. My mother, Diane, was the silent architect of this arrangement, a woman who believed a daughter's purpose was to absorb the family's burdens so her son could fly. And me, I was the foundation. Unseen, unthanked, but utterly essential. I was the one who made sure the bills were tracked, the meals were cooked, and the fragile illusion of a functioning family was maintained. I was a function, not a daughter, and for 18 years I played my part perfectly, but every foundation has a breaking point. If you've ever felt like your voice was being swallowed by the silence in a room, just take a second to comment with the word "here" so I know you understand this feeling. That foundation I talked about wasn't just built with my labor. It was mortared with their words. The control in our house was rarely a raised fist. It was a carefully spoken sentence, delivered over dinner or while I was washing dishes. It was a psychological architecture designed to keep me small. My father's favorite phrase, whenever I mentioned a book I was reading or a class I enjoyed, was, "Don't get ideas, Grace." It wasn't a warning. It was a command. Ideas were dangerous. They were escape routes. My mother's approach was softer, but somehow more cutting. "Shane has potential," she'd say, watching him play video games on the couch. "You have responsibilities." She presented it like a law of nature, an undeniable truth that placed my existence firmly in service to his. They never said, "We need you here." They said, "Be practical." They never said, "Your dreams don't matter." They asked, "Who's going to look after things if you're gone?" Every word was a brick in the wall around my future. They were building my prison and teaching me to call it home, convincing me the bars were there for my own protection. It's a slow, quiet kind of erosion when the people who are supposed to build you up spend years carefully taking you apart, piece by piece, until you forget what you were supposed to look like in the first place. Words have this incredible power, don't they? Wherever you are in the world right now, I want you to think about one positive word that someone once said that truly lifted you up. If you feel comfortable, share that single word in the comments. Let's fill this space with the kind of language we all deserve. But even in a prison of words, a small, stubborn part of you learns to look for a key. My key was $200. For a year, I had been taking extra shifts at the Millfield diner, coming home smelling of grease and stale coffee. I'd serve locals who looked just as tired as I felt, and every crumpled dollar bill of my tips went into the same place, a hollowed-out copy of Great Expectations, hidden under my mattress. That $200 wasn't just money, it was the application fee for the community college one town over. It was a bus ticket out of Millfield. It was the price of a different future, one where my name wasn't synonymous with responsibility. It was the most valuable thing I owned. One Tuesday afternoon, I came home from a shift, my hands still smelling of bleach from cleaning the counters, and I went to my room to add the day's earnings. The book was there, but the cash wasn't. Panic, cold and sharp, shot through me. But it wasn't the panic of confusion. It was the sickening panic of certainty. I didn't even have to look far. I walked into the living room, and there was Shane, lounging on the recliner, wearing a brand new, gleaming white pair of noise-canceling headphones. He was literally wearing my future, using it to block out the sounds of the very house I was forced to maintain. He hadn't just stolen my money, he had stolen my escape, and he didn't even have the decency to look guilty. He just smiled. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the muffled beat coming from my future, wrapped around my brother's ears. And then, a voice I barely recognized as my own cut through the air. It wasn't a shout. It was low, and it didn't tremble. "Now take them off, Shane." He just smirked, pretending he couldn't hear me. My mother, Diane, drifted in from the kitchen, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. "Grace, don't start." But it had already started. The dam of 18 years had a crack in it. I walked over and pulled the headphones off his head. "He took $200 from my room," I said, my voice dangerously calm, looking not at him, but at my parents who were now both standing there. My father's jaw tightened. "It was my application money," I continued, letting the words hang in the air, "and you're going to do nothing about it." It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. I saw the entire pathetic dynamic of our family in that one moment, the prince, the warden, and the silent partner. And I finally said the words that had been poisoning me from the inside out. "You have raised a useless, pathetic monster from the scraps of your own failures, and you expect me to spend the rest of my life cleaning up after him." I looked at all of them, one by one. I'm done. The shock on their faces wasn't from guilt. It was from blasphemy. I had just broken the first and only commandment of our home. Grace stays quiet. This was my crossroads, a choice between swallowing my truth or letting it shatter the world around me. Comment with a 1 if you've ever chosen silence in a moment like that, and a 2 if you chose to speak up. There's no judgment here, only shared experience. The silence that followed my declaration was heavier than any I had ever known in that house. It was a vacuum, waiting for the violence it knew was coming. It didn't wait long. My father, Walter, didn't yell. His movements were terrifyingly precise. He reached for the nearest plate on the kitchen counter, one I had washed and dried just that morning, and smashed it on the linoleum floor. Shards of ceramic sprayed across the room. "That," he growled, his voice low and guttural, "is your place, cleaning up what's broken." But his rage was a fire that needed more fuel. My defiance had been too great. He stormed past me towards the hall closet, the one that smelled of dust and rust, and wrenched open the door. He fumbled inside for a moment before pulling out his old toolbox, a relic from his days at the mill. He didn't grab a belt. He grabbed a heavy, steel pipe wrench, its metal surface dull under the dim light. It was a tool from a life where he had power, where he could bend steel to his will. Now, he was going to try and bend me. He advanced, the wrench held loosely at his side, and for the first time, my body screamed at me to run, but my feet were led. I stood my ground, and as he raised it slightly, I looked straight into the hollowed-out parts of his eyes, and I didn't see a father. I saw a scared, weak man. And with a calm that terrified him more than any scream, I whispered, "Go on, prove me right." The heavy wrench lowered, not with a clang, but with a slow, tired sigh of defeated metal. My father, Walter, looked at the tool in his hand as if he'd never seen it before. He hadn't broken my bones, but I had broken his spirit, that fragile, tyrannical thing he called his authority. In his eyes, I saw something worse than hatred. I saw that he had nothing left. I didn't run. I simply turned my back on him, on the shattered plate, on my mother's silent tears, on my brother who was now staring at me with a flicker of fear. I walked to the front door, opened it, and stepped out into the humid Ohio night. I didn't take a jacket. I didn't take a single dollar. To take anything would have been to admit that something in that house had ever truly belonged to me. The only place to go was Rachel's house, 3 blocks away. Her porch light was a beacon. When she opened the door, she didn't gasp or bombard me with questions. She just saw my face, stood aside, and let me in. The warmth of her house was a physical shock. As I sat on the edge of her bed, my phone began to buzz. My mother's name lit up the screen, then my father's. Each buzz felt like a hook trying to snag me and drag me back. I stared at the glowing screen, and for the first time, felt nothing. No fear, no anger, just distance. I held down the power button until the screen went black. It wasn't just a phone I was turning off, it was the leash. In that moment, in the quiet of Rachel's room, I knew my new strategy. They thrived on my reaction, so I would give them none. I would become a ghost in my own story. For 2 weeks, the silence was absolute. I existed in the bubble of Rachel's home, slowly learning to breathe air that wasn't thick with resentment. I started sleeping through the night. The ghost strategy was working. They had no one to react to, no one to blame. I had simply vanished from their ecosystem. Then, one afternoon, the bubble burst. A knock on the door. It was my mother, Diane, standing on the porch, looking smaller and more frayed than I'd ever seen her. Rachel's mom let us have the porch to talk, a small mercy that kept me out of a car and away from my old house. My mother didn't apologize. Apologies weren't in her vocabulary. Instead, she tried to weave a net of guilt and obligation. "The house is a mess, Grace," she began. "Your father isn't eating right. Shane, he's struggling." It was all about them. Always. Then came the real reason for her visit, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Listen, just come home. Help me get things settled again. If you do that," she leaned in, "your father said he would consider helping you with that application fee. Consider, not he will, but he might." It was a breadcrumb tossed to a starving dog, a bargain designed to put the leash right back around my neck. It was a test, and in that moment, looking at the desperation in her eyes, I saw the trap for exactly what it was. Have you ever been offered a deal that felt more like a cage? A choice where the good option would end up costing you a piece of yourself? If you know exactly what I'm talking about, just write the word deal in the comments. It's a quiet nod between people who get it. Later that night, I gave Rachel my answer to pass along. Tell her my price for coming home is an apology, and they can't afford it. After my message was delivered through Rachel, the silence from my family returned, but this time it felt different. It was the heavy, stubborn silence of a stalemate. I threw myself into studying for my GED at the local library and picking up more shifts at the diner, slowly rebuilding that $200. I didn't seek out news of them, but in a town as small as Millfield, you don't have to. News travels like a stray dog, finding its way to you whether you want it to or not. Rachel would come home with little pieces of the puzzle. She heard Shane had been fired from his job at the auto parts store for showing up late, too many times. Someone else mentioned seeing my father, Walter, at the corner tavern in the middle of the afternoon. The house itself was apparently starting to show the strain. The lawn was overgrown, and the mail was piling up on the porch. But the final clarifying piece of information came about a month after I left. Rachel found me studying at our usual table at the library, her eyes wide. She had just spoken to Mrs. Gable from down the street. My parents, in their infinite pride, had concocted a story. They were telling everyone that I had been accepted into a prestigious arts program and had gone to live with a wealthy aunt out in California. They invented a successful daughter because they couldn't handle the truth of the one who had escaped. The lie didn't hurt me. It set me free. It was the ultimate proof that their love was conditional on the image I projected. They didn't miss me. They missed the role I played. And I decided then and there to let them have their fictional daughter. She could keep them company. 6 months passed. 6 months of blessed, productive silence. I earned my GED with honors and was accepted into the Certified Nursing Assistant program at the County Technical College. I was building a life from the ground up, a life that belonged to me. The news came on a Tuesday morning. My grandmother, my father's mother, had passed away. She was the only one in that entire family who ever looked at me with something other than expectation. She never intervened, but she saw me. I decided to go to the funeral, not for them, but for her. I walked into the small, wood-paneled funeral home in Millfield wearing my simple black nursing school trousers and a plain white blouse. I was neat. I was composed. I was there. The whispers in the room died the second they saw me. I saw my mother, Diane, physically flinch as if she'd been struck. Shane couldn't even look at me. His gaze was suddenly fascinated by his own shoes. And then there was my father. He looked like he had aged a decade. The rage that had always radiated from him like heat from asphalt was gone, replaced by a hollow, weary gray. He took a half step towards me, his mouth opening slightly as if to assert some long-lost authority, but no words came out. The man whose voice had been the soundtrack to my confinement was now utterly silent. He had nothing to say. I didn't either. I simply gave him a brief, polite nod, the kind you give a distant acquaintance, and took a seat at the back. I didn't need to say a word. My presence, calm and complete, was enough. It's strange, isn't it, how the loudest statement you can make is just by showing up in your own power. As I'm sharing this moment from my past, I'm curious, what time is it for you right now, wherever you are in the world? Just type the time in the comments. Let's connect all of our different moments together. The funeral was a turning point. Seeing their powerlessness solidified my resolve. I buried myself in my studies. A year later, I was a certified nursing assistant working for a local agency. Rachel, meanwhile, had completed a 2-year business program at the same county college I had once dreamed of. We were sitting in her small apartment one evening, surrounded by textbooks and takeout boxes, when the idea sparked. I was telling her about the immense need I saw every day, elderly people in Millfield, forgotten by a town that was too busy dying to care for its own. Their children had moved away for jobs, leaving them isolated. They needed reliable, compassionate care, the very thing I had been trained to do my entire life, both in my family's house and in my nursing classes. Rachel looked at me, her eyes lit with an idea. "So let's do it better," she said. And just like that, Millfield Care was born. She handled the business side, turning her small living room into our corporate headquarters. I was in charge of care, training, and client relations. Our first office was her kitchen table. Our company car was her beat-up 2008 Honda Civic. We worked 18-hour days. We poured every cent we made back into the business. We built our reputation one client at a time, one act of kindness, one moment of professional, dependable care. The irony was so thick, I could taste it. The skills my family had forced upon me to keep me small and serviceable, patience, organization, managing schedules, caring for the helpless, were now the very pillars of my own thriving enterprise. I wasn't just surviving, I was building an empire on the foundation of my own servitude. Our business, Millfield Care, grew. We moved from the kitchen table to a small, rented office downtown. We had 3 other caregivers on staff and a reputation for being the most reliable service in the county. It was a Tuesday morning, and I was reviewing payroll when Rachel took a call for a new client intake. She scribbled down the address on a notepad, her expression unreadable, and slid it across the desk to me. 142 Elm Street. My hands went cold. It was the address I had run from in the middle of the night 2 years earlier. It felt like a summons from a past life. I drove there myself in our company's branded car, wearing the crisp blue scrubs with our logo stitched over the heart. I walked up the cracked concrete path, not as a fearful daughter, but as a business owner. I knocked on the door I had once slammed behind me. My mother opened it. The color drained from her face. The house behind her was dark and smelled of stale air and neglect. My father was sitting in his old recliner, a thick blanket pulled over his legs, looking shrunken and pale. He had fallen, she explained meekly. I stepped inside, not with nostalgia, but with the detached professionalism I'd been trained for. I pulled out my clipboard. Good afternoon, I said, my voice even and clear. I'm Grace, the director from Millfield Care. I understand you need an in-home assessment for Mr. Walter. Using his first name felt too familiar. Using Dad was impossible. Mr. Walter was perfect. I began the intake questions, my pen scratching on the paper. Can you describe Mr. Walter's current mobility limitations? What medications is he taking? They had no choice but to answer. In their own decaying living room, they were the helpless ones, and I was the one in charge. I finished my checklist, each tick of the pen a final, quiet period on a long-running sentence. I looked up from my clipboard, meeting my mother's desperate gaze, and then my father's averted one. There was no triumph in me, no desire for revenge. There was only the calm, clean finality of a business transaction coming to a close. Thank you for your time, I said, my voice as neutral as a cloudy sky. After reviewing the situation, I've determined that due to a prior personal conflict, Millfield Care will be unable to take on this case. It would be unprofessional. I reached into my bag and pulled out a brochure with a list of other local agencies. I placed it on the cluttered coffee table next to a pile of old mail. I wish you the best of luck in finding suitable care. And with that, I turned and walked out of that door for the last time. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The lesson from all this, the one I want to leave with you, is this. Your value is never determined by your usefulness to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. True power isn't about winning their arguments. It's about having the courage to stop attending them. You don't have to set fire to the bridge. Sometimes you just have to walk away and let it collapse under the weight of its own rot. The loudest revenge isn't a scream. It's the quiet echo of your own peace, your own success, in the space they can no longer occupy. My story started with a broken plate, but it ends with a life I built with my own 2 hands. If you believe in the power of walking away, in the strength it takes to build your own future from scratch, then I'm asking you to join this community. Hit that subscribe button, not just for my story, but as a promise to honor your own journey of self-worth. Let's build our palaces together,